Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. If you want to understand how feminism has shaped the mind of American women over the last 70 years, and the cultural arc from Doris Day to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, from Ruth Bader Ginsburg to Roseanne, from Taylor Swift to Dylan Mulvaney, the man who Bud Light imagines is a woman, then join me today alongside my co-host Leroy Hill as we unpack Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique. Her book did more than critique the suburban housewife of Leave It to Beaver era. It succeeded in redefining womanhood and femininity in modern American life. To top things off, our conversation wraps up with practical guidelines for Christian women seeking to stand firm and flourish in a culture saturated with sexual confusion, fear of families, and a female identity crisis. To understand why Friedan's book had an immediate and lasting impact, we need to look at her brand of feminism not as an isolated movement, but as the second in a sequence of movements, each more radical than the last. To those unfamiliar, here's a helpful summary of the broad themes and animating assumptions that helped shape the three waves of American feminism. First wave feminism, beginning around 1848, was inspired by a Christian worldview, which, at least at a cultural level, assumed women were image bearers of God and therefore moral equals to men. It asked the political and legal question, can women be recognized as full citizens with the same legal rights, independent of their fathers, brothers, and husbands? Its focus was advocacy for women's suffrage, property rights, and de jure equality. In short, first-wave feminism was a movement defined by the pursuit of legal rights independent from men. Second-wave feminism effectively began in 1963 with the publication of The Feminine Mystique. In her book, Friedan asked a question shaped by secular humanism. Can women live fully autonomous, self-directed lives in every sphere of society? Its aim was the dismantling of social, legal, and cultural constraints related to work, family, and sexuality. Whereas the first wave of feminism sought equality before the law, the second wave sought liberation from inherited social roles seen as oppressive. In short, second wave feminism was defined by the pursuit of social status independent from social norms. Third wave feminism emerged around 1991 and asked a far more radical question shaped by postmodern and atheist materialistic assumptions. Who has the authority to define what a woman is? Here, the emphasis shifted to identity, intersectionality, and the rejection of any fixed or universal definition of womanhood. Womanhood itself was no longer received as a biological reality, but treated as a category to be constructed, negotiated, or reinvented on purely individual terms. In short, third-wave feminism is defined by the pursuit of self-identity independent from any external or transcendent truth. Keeping these three waves, their distinctives, and their similarities in mind, the focus on today's podcast is on the second question. Can women live fully autonomous, self-directed lives in every sphere of society? And how Friedan's culturally toxic answers shaped the Western worldview. Before diving in, let me offer a short bio of Betty Friedan based on our book by Weikart that we've been exploring over these last many months, and the work of feminist Gail Collins, who I link to in the show notes. Friedan was born in 1921 in Peoria, Illinois, the daughter of Harry Goldstein, an atheist jeweler, and Miriam Horowitz Goldstein, his beautiful, bitter, and domineering wife. Friedan's parents were both Jewish immigrants who were upper middle class and endured anti-Jewish sentiment. In addition to the cultural isolation she experienced growing up, Betty experienced a great deal of misery in her home life. Her father, Harry, insisted that his wife Miriam abandon her work writing for the society pages and devote herself entirely to being a housewife. By Friedan's own admission, she would come to associate her mother's rage and the unhappiness of her childhood home with her mother's resentment of being confined to the identity of housewife. Finding a cure for that misery is the hidden autobiographical undertones of The Feminine Mystique. And while Betty inherited atheism from her father, from her mother she inherited a violent temper. Her mother's beauty was passed to Betty's sister Amy, while Betty herself, by the admission of even the most sympathetic biographers, was considered homely. A fact that her mother never allowed her to forget just how homely she was. Miriam's cruelty left Betty with a bitter awareness of her own unattractiveness, combined with an intense longing for romance. More damaging still was her mother's temperament. Charming in public, cruel at home, Miriam despised her husband, considered herself socially superior to him, and directed particular hostility towards Betty, whose prominent nose reminded her of her husband Harry. The Goldstein home was saturated with animosity. Miriam spent far beyond the family's means to maintain her self-image, even during the Great Depression. Consequently, the girl Betty grew up into the woman Betty, left with deep psychological scars. Friedan went off to school and graduated from Smith College in the middle of World War II. She watched with adult eyes as the post-war American economy exploded, producing a mass middle class with a standard of living unprecedented in human history. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, most American families owned their homes, drove cars, watched television, took vacations, and hoped to send their children to college. But this explosion in wealth, especially in an increasingly secular culture, came at a price. The desire to meet consumer demand meant that more people needed to work. Jobs were so plentiful that employers openly discussed advertising campaigns designed to entice married women into part-time clerical or retail work to earn pin money for the household extras. The post-Depression prosperity came with new pressures on husbands, families, and especially on women, who were increasingly expected to find their identity, fulfillment, and moral worth in consumption, appearance, and domestic performance. It's in this social context that Betty Friedan launched what many credit as the second wave of feminism. Whereas the first wave, as I mentioned before, was guided by Susan B. Anthony and other female-led Christian organizations who fought to include women within existing social structures, Friedan was not concerned with women being brought into these systems, but in freeing women from these illegitimate systems that kept the feminine identity, in her view, shrouded in mystery. She especially despised what she saw as the interconnected and monolithic system of Christianity, marriage, motherhood, and domestic life. As with figures like Margaret Mead and Alfred Kinsey, who we've covered in previous episodes of Raise the Roof, Friedan's private life provided both an illuminating and unsettling perspective on her 1963 hit book, The Feminine Mystique. Like her predecessors, Friedan's book is in some ways an autobiography disguised as social science. The Feminine Mystique, which attempted to name, quote, the problem that has no name, end quote, was itself shaped by deeply personal wounds that Friedan experienced. As historian Gail Collins observed, Friedan's book was a very specific cry of rage about the way intelligent, well-educated women were kept out of the mainstream of American professional life and regarded as little more than a set of reproductive organs and heels. Her writing is intensely personal, and that is precisely what gives her book its power. At its core, though, The Feminine Mystique is not really a political book. It's a book about meaning, identity, and fulfillment. It's a book about worldview. Friedan asked a question that sounded psychological, but was in fact a deeply theological question. What must I do to become a fully authentic human and live the life of an authentic woman? And that question is where my conversation with my co-host Leroy Hill begins. We really started this series of shows 3.5 years ago. I forgot that we had actually done our first show in this series in June, July of 2022. And then we really kind of started we did another show about 6 months later in this series. And then we started in earnest covering these 15 philosophers and cultural influencers who've shaped the modern worldview of the West, looking at it through the framework of a book called 10 Books That Screwed Up the World. But man, I didn't realize we'd started and been such an ongoing thing. So Leroy, what do you think, man? What do you think about this whole series as you look back on it? Any thoughts, memories, hopefully positive? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it is it became something that I wasn't really expecting, right? It wasn't what I expected. I thought we were just going to look at a book that talked about 10 views that screwed up the world. I really didn't think that we'd be really looking at the root ideas, the base ideas, and their etiologies, so to speak, their beginnings, and how those etiologies have worked up. Even though it's a book that talks about the 10 views that screwed up the world, what it really does for us is it puts in one place it's almost a repository of all the bad ideas that ever took over the world. And it was very interesting for me is as we work through those ideas, I mean, these ideas are still prevalent. They're still having an outworking in society today. And they're
Hmm.
still as bad as they are as deeply in fashion today as they were when they first hit.
Yeah, for me, it's been really interesting because some of these books I'd read bits and pieces over the years, some I'd read fully, some I'd never read. Like the book we're looking at today, I'd never read The Feminine Mystique, but I knew about it. I'd heard about it. I'd watched interviews and talks with people who are connected with it over the years. So, what I found really interesting for me over this whole thing, and if people missed an episode, you can go back to Raise the Roof. It's available on Spotify and iTunes. Find it at morethancake.org. But what I found really interesting is kind of like what you were saying is seeing in greater detail how these ideas, having looked at them directly and where they're really showing up, not just even in the secular culture, but even in the church, has been really eye opening. And a lot of the
Mhm.
political commentary people I listen to, a lot of the folks that I hear dialoguing about these things, I see a lot of mistakes, I guess you could say, or some superficial analysis in
Mhm.
what they're doing. And if they're not analyzing the problems correctly, they're not going to come up with the right solutions. And so
Right.
I feel like this has been a real benefit to me in discerning where these ideas are deforming our own worldviews and giving us a wrong perception of what's really happening. Anything like that for you? Has that kind of been your
Well,
experience?
I remember years and years ago, someone wrote a series called 10 Philosophies, or is it 12 Philosophies in an Hour? So
Mm-hmm.
they put out a disc. It was a 1 hour disc where they looked at the analysis of the great philosophers and their philosophies. And here's why that was important for me. The recurring theme throughout that whole series was that these guys put their ideas out in the world, but they never applied their ideas to themselves, right? They never applied those ideas to them. And ultimately what happened was they would, once you begin to apply their ideas to their lives, you could see the disconnect or the disharmony and the fallacies within those ideas, especially in the way that they live. And I think this book is similar to that effect. These folks, consider them well-meaning, consider them however you will, they never really could live out their ideas. Yet they were
Mm-hmm.
not afraid to voice those ideas out into the world and help other people live them out. And they've been destructive. They've been completely destructive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we'll see some similar things in Friedan's work here that we'll look at, the feminine mystique. But before we even dive into that, but before we even dive into that, I want to look at just the title itself, because that might throw some people off. I have to admit, having prior to this time not really examined her book, I had a misperception of what that idea of feminine mystique was all about. I thought maybe it was an idea of just the wonderment and awe of feminine identity and wiles or whatever that might be. I, but I think Friedan means it in a bit more of a negative sense than I would have taken it. So,
Mhm.
can you summarize what was her big idea? What did she mean by this language of the feminine mystique, and how did that fit into her overall project? Yeah, we'll dive in for everyone. We're going to get into the more worldview nuts
Sure.
and bolts of this, but just set the stage for what this even is about.
Yeah, for Mystique, she didn't mean it in a positive or sacred or poetic sense. What she meant it in as a framework or a cultural um, idea or identity. For Friedan, the feminine mystique was a cultural ideology disguised as destiny. And
Mm-hmm.
what she was trying to avoid was what I believe it's either I get these two guys confused, Charles Taylor or Alistair McIntyre, what they talked about as an inherited story. An inherited story for them goes something like this: none of us are born separate of our stories. There's a story that is going on before us, the story that our parents and their parents inhabit, and we're born into that story, and that story goes on long after we leave. And what Friedan was attempting to do was to name that story. She wanted to say that the stories that we inherited, that marriage and motherhood were for women, were for us, were where we found our deepest fulfillment, were wrong. Um,
Mm-hmm.
she wanted people to pursue their deepest aspirations in pleasing themselves, in looking at themselves, and being independent. And she thought that women who felt dissatisfaction with their roles should not internalize that dissatisfaction or not view it as personal failure because they felt that way. So for her, the mystique was the invisible framework that made a very specific version of womanhood feel
Mm-hmm.
uh, natural, right,
Mm-hmm.
and true
Yeah.
and unquestionable. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's helpful. And in my short take on it is that she looked at feminism as a mystery shrouded in an enigma kind of thing. It's the culture was really hiding the true feminine, the world, the systems and everything were keeping women from truly becoming women. And
right.
she was gonna unveil that mystery and tear down all those false
Can,
ideas.
can you
And
see
yeah,
how similar that is to critical theory?
yeah.
It is
Well,
similar in
we're gonna
flow
touch
to
there.
critical theory.
I don't want to stop you, but we're gonna touch there too for folks. We're gonna kind of push it. It will open that door. But go ahead.
Yeah, it is doing the same thing. I mean, it is. I would wonder if Foucault was an influence for her because she viewed women were inheriting a story, a power story where they were the oppressed within that power story, and they needed to throw off the
Mm-hmm.
chains of the patriarchy. So,
I think that might have been an influence for her, but I don't think that was a. My guess is, and I've listened to some of the debates she's done and some interviews she's done in prep for this, several hours worth of stuff, to be honest, in addition to reading the book. And I don't think that might have been a direct influence to her, but it definitely was on a lot of the feminists. So let me frame it
mhm,
this way to distinguish between first wave, second wave, and third wave feminism, just as a simple summary, because she's what we would call a second wave feminist. So the first wave
mhm,
feminism was driven by really largely by a belief in equality that was given by God. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, human beings, are created equal. That ideal, even if they weren't Christian or believers, it was that first wave feminism was driven by that idea. It really asked the question, can women be recognized as full legal persons and citizens? Right? Can we be? Should we be? What's our legal status? And that status was, in a sense, independent of, am I married to this certain man, or am I the daughter of this certain person? They wanted to know that as a woman, independent of a man in their life, can they have legal status? That was first wave feminism. Second wave feminism, which is Friedan, which is what she sort of ushered in, she was driven by the humanist ideal of freedom. And she asked this kind of question, can women live fully autonomous, self-directed lives in every sphere of society? And actually, Joshua Davidson chimed in, Leroy. I'm trying to put it up here. I don't know why it's not showing up here.
it did for a second.
Oh, it did. Maybe I hit it too many times. There it is. Anyway, Joshua Davidson's asking, he's saying the preposterous idea that we should magically become the main characters of our own disjointed miniature narratives. And I think that's actually not too bad. It's actually not too bad because it was this idea that women could be autonomous, again, independent of any other aspect of being labeled a mother or a wife or a daughter. And it was looking more of a social autonomy, not just to have recognition within the society, but really to tear down the structures of society. And we'll dive into some of that as well, and why she does that, right? So they want to tear those things down and really be, like Joshua says, the main characters in their own story. And then third wave feminism, and this is the part you bring in with Foucault and others. Third wave feminism, which is really probably like 40 years after, really, that begins sort of in the 80s, I guess, is if I had to pick a date based on what I've read. There's no, obviously these are squishy ideas that there's no clarity and exactly there's a moment. But a third wave feminism was driven by, I would say, that neo-Marxist denial of any truth beyond the self. And it's really asking that question, can we even define what a woman is? Because there was this sense of autonomy. There's no ontological reality. There's no teleological truth. There's nothing ultimate. And everything is going to be subjective to the individual. And so it sort of extends that humanist idea to a very much atheist idea, if you will, in the identification of womanhood. So what do you think about that framing? Do you think that's a fair framing, Leroy? Do you think you'd add some?
I think that's an accurate framing of her perspective. I think that's a totally accurate framing of her perspective. But as you were talking, I just couldn't help but see how she began to frame this idea. And for her, this idea is the result of deep dissatisfaction. But it comes at a specific point in history, right? It comes at a specific point in history. So, for example, what I love about the Bibles, and this is kind of mythopoeic, in other words, it's kind of like story, is when the Bible says at just the right time, God sent forth his son, right? I love that verse because when you look at history, Plato had spent 400 and some odd years knocking out polytheism, right? And Aristotle comes after him and builds on those ideas. And the roads in Rome were paved so that the known world was getting closer and closer to a shared form of reality, so to speak, right? And it was at that time when the roads were paved, when we were getting closer to almost a shared form of reality in the way that we thought, that God sent forth his son. And I'm saying that Friedan's ideas appear at that particular point in history when barbarism is largely settled, right? Where women can have a voice and be protected, right? Like if the Stone Age and Neanderthal times were true, if they actually happened, and women were being dragged around by their hair and kicked by cavemen, can you imagine a Betty Friedan coming up in that moment? It couldn't come into be at that point in time in history. Why? Because people were more barbaric. There were less laws and there were less rules, and the space for those ideas to come about just didn't exist. It didn't even enter into those mythical people's minds, so to speak. So she appears at a particular point in history when barbarism has been put down and law is championed, and people can really, particularly women, can express themselves freely and have a voice and be educated, right? So her ideas don't appear when they do for no reason, is what I'm getting at. For no reason. And it can only make sense in that context, so to speak.
Yeah, you are right in the moment she's at historically after the war. There's a lot of circumstances of women being having gone to work outside the home to sustain the nation, and now husbands are back. What is their role? There's a lot of fluidity in the culture. There's a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of difficulties there. And again, Joshua is on fire here with those little comments, but he's right that we're all going to say there's some externally relevant thing. They're going to deny those universals, but she was a woman of her age in a sense. And there were true issues she was responding to. We'll cover some of that later, especially when it gets to the moral right and wrong of issues and identity issues.
Yeah, I'm not saying what I said to dismiss.
Oh, no, I don't think you said it at all. I'm glad you said that.
she's brought up a good, an apt and accurate critique and a conversation that we need to be having. I'm just saying that there's a cultural context that her ideas seem to kind of float on top of, right?
Mm-hmm.
They kind of float on top of and don't take into account. I mean, so for example, when I grew up, my dad told me that until I got married, my job was to protect my older sister. We went to school together. If somebody picked
Yeah.
on my sister had one ear and she was subject to being teased. And if I saw guys picking on my sister, I don't care how big they were, it was my job to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
well, it wasn't her job to protect me. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It was
Yeah.
my job as her little brother to protect her. So that's the kind of upbringing that I had and grew up in. You had to fight older boys and bigger boys and be willing to stand up and protect my sister. But Betty Friedan would say, Leon, my sister Leona should have protected herself. She
Yeah.
should have fought those boys. You know.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point to start looking at some of this context through this worldview lens that Friedan brought in and
Hmm.
how her own ideas shaped her thinking. So outside of the immediate political context, she has a view of how did I come into being, right? What makes us human? What defines our reality? And for me, it appears she's an atheist worldview. She treats humans as evolving, self-directed,
Hmm.
very Freudian. We did our whole show on Freud as well. So there's a very Freudian sort of influence of how she interprets herself, her identity, her sexuality, all those elements of her life. But your identity is developed through education, freedom, participation in the world. And she rejects any idea that biology alone defines human nature. So she's not going to be a materialist in that sense. She's not going to be a pure determinist, but she's going to say all these other influences matter. And again, that sense, I think she's following in that Freudian sort of line. She says, for example, women are human beings, not stuffed dolls, not animals, even though we evolved from animals, but there's something more there. And our identity is rooted more. Biology says, quote, the nature of the human relationship to biology has changed. Our increasing knowledge has given us an awareness of purpose and goals beyond the simple biological needs. And in that sense, she's going to say, sexuality, the idea of a woman having sex with a man and producing babies, those are biological things, but the feminine identity must be beyond those things and not be constrained by those mere she almost reduces those things to mere biologicals, as opposed to, because there's no God, purposeful, designed, fulfilling events. She's going to see those as almost biologically oppressive to the nature
Hmm.
of the true nature of the feminine. Right. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, she definitely wants to transcend biology. I mean, the nice juicy tendril floating out there is, I mean, now for women to be fully free and autonomous beings, they have to be free from the consequences of they have to be free from the consequences of their biology. And their biology states that if you have sex with a man, there's going to be quite possibly a long-term result of those activities, right? And it's
Which
like
you
you
wanted
said,
to free the woman from
where
through
you free women
birth
from.
control, all those
So
things.
control again, the time in history that it appears, birth control now is on the horizon, and then obviously abortion as a form of birth control
Mm-hmm.
is on the horizon. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to me that under the guise of freedom and human flourishing, she created the situation for more death. I shouldn't say she created, that's not fair, but she contributed to the situation for more death to occur than we've experienced in all of human history.
Yeah.
Under the guise of
She's funny because I watched a debate she had in the 90s, and she was of the feminist brand. This is when the third wave feminism started to take hold, and she tried to distance herself from third wave feminism, but she was of the view that she supported the right to abortion, but not abortion itself. She tried to take
right.
that position. She was in
Yeah.
that strain, which you just tried to summarize. I didn't. I believe in it,
Yeah,
but not in actually doing it, or one of
right.
those sort of things.
She threw her ideas out there and didn't think that people would take her seriously.
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense. You know, if
Mhm.
I were to sum up her view, I wrote it here. I am trapped in a life that denies my full humanity, and liberation comes through education, freedom, autonomy, and productive self-expression. That's the
Mhm.
positive outworking of her view. And then when you look at it from the perspective of a woman, um, there's aspects of that that really speak to a deep need to be significant in the
Mhm.
world. I remember being at an event. I won't say the name of the event, and the room was full of men, and there was this large theological debate going on, and there was two women in the room, and one woman kept raising her hand to speak. Right, she kept raising her hand to speak, but that
Was
isn't
this
how
your
the men were.
wife?
No, no,
Oh, I'm just kidding. Totally kidding.
no. My wife. I've taught my wife very well.
Oh,
If you're in a room, no, I'm being honest. I told
I
her
know,
if you're in a
but I
room
just know how
with
that
men
sounds.
speaking. Oh, I know it sounds bad, but I'm telling you, I told her. If you're in a room with men are speaking theologically and nobody's raising their hands and they're waiting for the moment to interject, if you want to be in that room and in that context, you better be like the rest of those people. You don't shrink in those. You have something to say, you wait till the right time and then you say it. Don't wait for someone
Yeah.
to acknowledge you. I watched this woman in that room keep raising her hand and raising her hand and no one acknowledging her. And I said, I raised my hand later. I said, okay, I interjected. Jennifer, what do you think? And I gave her an opportunity to speak. This wasn't at one of our events, so I will say that it wasn't at one of our events, but she was there, and she had something very significant to say. She's a very smart woman. She had something very significant to say. And what was amazing to me is afterward, I told her the same thing I said to my wife. If you're going to be in those events with men, and this is, I think, where Friedan is coming from, then you need to have a voice. You can't be a shrinking violet. You can't
Mhm.
act as if people are going to acknowledge you and give you space. I even told my young men as they were growing up when I was a coach, you got to have big elbows. You got to take up
Yeah.
space. You got to take up space.
Yeah.
And,
There's a little bit
and I
of a
think,
little. Oh, I was
go
gonna say
ahead. I'm
this is a
sorry.
little bit of a rabbit trail, but from this specific question, but it does remind me of a story. I was listening to a particular woman on social media who was a teacher of the Bible, well respected gal. I won't bother to say her name; it's not really that important. But she was all of a sudden sort of became this progressive Christian voice when she had
Oh,
been
I know who
this
you're talking about.
strong biblical voice for a lot of years. Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, the discerning reader will know.
Right.
But she started describing these sexist men that she had been surrounded by for years. And she said, I was in a room with these men and they were all jockeying for position and they didn't want to acknowledge me or recognize my position. And this is the kind of male patriarchy that's out there. I'm like, no, that's what men do.
They do. That's
Every
exactly
other
right.
man, I have never walked into a room full of men where it's not some sort of
Competition.
contest, a
Yes.
competition for status and
Yes.
recognition. But
Yes.
this is not a thing about women. This is just how men in a
No,
group context are. And we'll actually talk about some of the
exactly.
group differences between men and women. But Friedan and others, and even these progressive Christian women today, are seeing that, oh, this is sexism. It's like, no,
In
this
family,
is what men do. I
in
don't
family,
necessarily
and
like it.
recognized the context, they've recreated and rebranded it as something evil.
Mm-hmm.
When, and really, what they're saying is, I want to be a woman in that context. Well, no, you don't. No, you don't. You want to play with the big boys, and you better act like a big boy.
Yeah.
If you can't run with the big dog, stay on the porch.
Yeah.
You gotta get out there and have big elbows. And I'll make this last point because I don't want to take us too far afield from
Yeah.
this.
We'll get to the next one in a point in a second
This
here.
is this is too this is largely the problem. They want to inhabit those spaces, but they want to live in one sense, they want to live in the world that men made, so to speak. I mean, I'm not trying to be sexist, I'm just trying to be acknowledge reality. But in the other sense, and they want to be men, like men in those spaces. But in the other sense, they want men to make room for them in those spaces in a way that a man would make room for a woman. Well, men don't make room for themselves. They don't make room for other
Yeah.
men. I mean, this is the verse when the scripture says a woman should learn in silence, right? Women read that and think the Bible is sexist until you ask the question, well, how in the heck were men supposed to learn, and how did they learn? They learned in silence. How many stories have we read about men following their rabbis at a distance, writing down everything that he says, right?
Hmm.
Listening to him, hanging on his every word. They learned in silence. And all Paul is doing in that situation is he's raising the point women ought to learn in silence in the same way that men learn. He didn't have to tell that to men because they've been learning that way for years. It would have been a redundancy for him to say the
Hmm.
same thing, right? But they
Yeah.
take that in some way, and I think that gives us a note into their own psychology
Yeah.
that we need to kind of understand.
Yeah, we'll delve into a little bit of difference between men and women. I have a clip that I want to share on that and get your thoughts on this analysis of feminism in that group dynamic, the differences between men and women that are real, but of course, feminism would want to reject. I'll give Josh's summary here real quick, and then I'll give my summary of this section. He says, women have become convinced that being the pinnacle of creation is demeaning. Treasure is not inferior for being protected. It's protected because its value is elevated. Women are a treasure. And of course, if there is no God, there is no pinnacle of creation, and everything becomes a self-identity. And that's my summary of Friedan's answer to that question of where did I come from is human origins we just originate as biological beings, but our true nature, woman's true nature, is defined by intellect, creativity, and self-realization, not
Mhm.
reproduction, not
Mm.
relationship to her father, not relationship to her husband, not even relationship to her children. And it's this isolation, this autonomy from these social structures, the autonomy from society itself, that she gets to freely define herself. It's a very different project than first
It
wave
is.
feminism, for sure.
It is.
And
And
that
you know
gets to
what's amazing
purpose. Oh yeah, go ahead.
what's amazing about it is she is authoring a new way of looking at reality that is not shared. I mean, the implicit idea is that there needs to be this new way of living in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but here's human nature. I mean, we have $1 billion video game industry, billions and billions and people play these video games. And you know what? The one thing every single video game has in common, they're all shared realities. There's certain rules that people have to live by if they're going to play the game. And this
Mm-hmm.
is so normative and unobtrusive and unoffensive that we spend billions and billions and billions of dollars. Only in the real world do we attempt to try to play by 7 billion different rules.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why society is collapsing in the way that it is right now, because there's no more shared reality. And what people realize, there's no enforcing arm, unless you live in
Mm-hmm.
a totalitarian country, for this shared reality to take place.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what you're exactly right. That's what she was going to reject in that second wave feminism. So getting to meaning and value, we've already touched on this a little bit in this answer of what is my purpose. So I'd say Friedan argues that meaning comes from, of course, self-realization, the full development of human capacities through purposeful work. Now, that's the interesting part, this purposeful work. What she defined as work really was saying, here's what men do, here's where men find their meaning. So therefore, if I do that work, I find my meaning.
Mhm.
Education, participation in the society. At the same time, she wanted to tear down society, which is sort of ironic. But she denies meaning found in God, of course, and she confines meaning with purpose and attaches both to work and those social roles. So she says things like, women are human beings set apart from the animals by the mind, the power to have an idea, a vision, a shape, the future of it. The key is to trap is education. That's how you escape this. So that can save American women from the greater dangers of this feminine mystique, the concealment of true femininity by the culture. If we can just we can educate our way out of that. And that was really a lot of it is education will save you from everything is very much an Enlightenment view, but that
Mhm.
certainly then shaped her idea of that as well. And she, of course, said the mystique denies the need to grow and fulfill one's potentialities as a human being, right? That Mystique's going to prevent women, the culture, the systems. So and you said Foucault earlier, in a sense, though, she is sort of looking at the systems as
Mhm.
oppressive
As oppressor,
and
power.
that they need to be torn down. But I think in a more, again, as I said before, a Freudian sense than
Yeah.
a
No, you're right.
Foucaultian sense
You're right.
that they structure. But it does certainly open the door to that third wave feminism, and there's no boundary condition to limit that from third wave feminism,
Oh,
even
it's the
though she
natural
would have
progression.
rejected that. But anyway, about purpose fulfillment, we've touched on this a little bit, but anything unique to add to that one?
Once you remove God from the equation, once you remove the anchor from reality from the equation, um, it's all up for grabs. Uh, Purpose is whatever 7 billion individuals think purpose is, right? It leads to. I'm almost certain this was McIntyre. Again, those two guys' ideas, but it almost leads to what he described as an unmooring. The interesting thing is, what I mean by unmooring is and you mentioned this earlier, the only thing that a person can really know is what's going on inside their mind. It's Descartes, it's Cartesian dualism. The only thing that a
Mhm.
person can really know is what is going on in their own mind, right? And according to Descartes, and that doesn't. Um, what it does is it unhitches us from each other. It untethers our minds from each other, and really, what we are is 7 billion people afloat in the universe, and we're drifting further and further apart. And because of that, as we said earlier, there's no shared story,
Mhm.
and people get to make it as they go along, and ultimately, what happens is, meaning Joshua talked about this a number of times, the real beauty that women have in their intellect, their athletic vim and vigor, their true value is not freed, it's ultimately diminished because they want to be less like themselves, whatever that means, and more like something else, whatever that
Mhm.
means. And it's almost like I'm a stranger to yourself. So in our times, the question of what is a woman is the natural progression of all of these ideas, because that question arises because we've lost what it means to be a woman. Men don't walk around discussing what is a man, right? We know what a man is, and I think men, most men, I should say, are men are uniquely inoculated from that idea of what is a man. I mean, someone once said that we can look in the mirror, no matter how old we are, no matter how out of shape we are, and we can find something great about ourselves. We can find something wonderful about ourselves, and I think that's true for men. I really do think that's true. That is because we haven't grown up with the idea that we are somehow lesser,
Mhm.
or that identity and who we are is defined by other things. People,
Yeah.
we really, for many, in many ways, have defined our reality by what we do or what we've accomplished,
Yeah.
whatever that is. And I think women are asking a slightly different question. Women want to have that mentality, I think, but they're asking a slightly different question.
Yeah.
Even in the thing that we're talking about, it's a disorienting question. What does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be a woman?
Yeah.
And some women are so confused by that they've allowed men to say women is whatever we define it to be.
Yeah. This is where the historical context you brought up earlier really comes into play, because Friedan is right in her criticism of what womanhood is not. And I mean
Hmm.
that in this sense of, she's at a time, not just because of the war and not just because of the circumstances of women going to work and finding fulfillment, all that sort of stuff, but in America especially, we were becoming far more secular in our thinking, far more humanist in our ideology. And we were losing any sense of the ultimate purpose found in God, who gives us identity, to be in the image of God. So she has no natural law way of discovering what a woman is. She has no way of observing the nature of a woman and saying, oh, I'm created in this beautiful way to reflect something about God's nature by being by reproducing, right? By bearing children, I am creating as my God creates. She doesn't have that view. So she sees it only in a socio-political, realpolitik way. Babies are the thing that keep women from entering the workforce, the real place of fulfillment, the real place of identity, the real place where men find fulfillment. Therefore, I need to find fulfillment there. And I don't need to subject myself to the oppression of biology. And so what she's seeing rightly in the culture is there was this point, I think, especially in the 50s and 60s, the Leave It to Beaver type of thing, where the culture was defining women by their role, by their physical role as a housewife. The housewife was the core identity of womanhood, but that wasn't the biblical identity of womanhood. And this is where I think a lot of Christians get it wrong today, especially Christians who talk about women should never work out of the house, or women should never do these things. And we need to go back to the biblical rule. And by that, they mean the 1950s rule. But that's not what biblical womanhood was. If you look at the Old Testament, the Proverbs 30, was it 39 wife? Yeah, 31 wife, right? But you looked at the entire structuring of society where the men weren't leaving home for work. The work was at home. So they were both building families and homes together. Yes, they had unique roles in that, but they were ostensibly working together. As societies, we became industrialized in the late 1800s. Men then started leaving the home to do work. Men weren't working at home with their wife, alongside their wife, and men started identifying as their work outside. What am I if I don't have this job? If I'm not the CEO, if I'm not this? Men lose their identity as well as women losing that. All Friedan did was buy into the cultural shift that identity was your work, and men bought into that. So then she's saying, well, women should buy into that too, instead of realizing that the problem was with the culture, which she identified, but because she denies the ultimate, she's not going to be able to solve that problem. And men, I think, are still suffering with that problem too. I know when I got fired from my job once, and I was unemployed, I sort of questioned, what kind of man am I? Can I provide? Can I do this? I struggled with that. But I don't think God wanted me to struggle with that. He had to teach me that it's important that I define who I am in Christ and in His created teleological designed order, not in those materialist ways. That is a genuine struggle that she faced for what women were, but she had no real solution. And this is where she struggled to and put purpose then in this self-actualization as opposed to a God.
And if I may, the problem that we also had in the church is that we adopted these ways of seeing women that didn't allow them to blossom. I mean, talked about, it was the proverbial 1950s woman that we wanted all women to kind of fit into. I mean, one of the things that I love about our school, Southern California Seminary, is obviously we believe in the God-given roles between men and women, obviously. But we're not going to deny women that come to the school and study deeply, advanced degrees, if they so choose. Why? Because theology is done in the community. Women have something to say. And it's best to be educated and to be able to speak to those issues, right? But some men take it upon themselves to say that because they can't get a job as a pastor, we should spare them the expense of going to school and really limit the roles that they should have and the understanding that they should have theologically. That's patriarchal. If you want to say anything about that, that's patriarchal. That's that's kind of sexist. So to speak, I would say that. But some people think that that's the normative way in which women ought to be. And like you said, where does that idea arise from? What is the root idea of that? Women shouldn't be pastors in their church, but they shouldn't be theologians. They shouldn't think deeply about the scriptures. They don't have anything to offer. Seriously? Is that what we're saying? And I think many men, good men whom I love and respect, would say yes. And that to me is somewhat frightening.
Yeah.
But that's not biblical. That's a cultural outworking, working its way into theological circles. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, my wife is a very smart woman. I was gonna say my wife, your wife is
Well,
super smart.
your wife's a
Uh,
doctor. Are you a doctor, Leroy?
I am not a doctor. I am not a doctor. Yeah, but there's only one Dr. Hill in this house, and it is not me.
Oh
But
my goodness.
but I've noticed. I'm just a casual observer here, and again, I want my wife in those spaces to have big elbows. I tell her, if you have something to say, you need to say it. I mean,
Hmm.
but here's let me take it this way. I think because I mean, let me say it this way. I'm just going to be straight out with it. I'm not going to be offensive or sexist. I'm just going to say it. Jordan Peterson said, in every male relationship, there is a an undercurrent of threat of violence in every male relationship, and because of that, men walk around with a natural respect for each other, right? In
Hmm.
other words, you don't go out. There's things you don't say to men without expecting that man might punch you in the grill, right?
Hmm.
Now, I will say that some women walk around and they don't have that concept in mind when they're dealing with men. And they are more, because they don't have that concept, they say things that many men will find offensive. And they should find
Yeah.
offensive. And they speak in ways to men that are deeply offensive, that men don't even speak to each other
Yeah.
in those
Do you
ways.
remember in my ethics class, I showed that video? I showed a video of a man punching a woman and then a man punching a man. I said, do you respond differently? Do you have a different feeling about these things? And
I
today
was traumatized by that
I've watched
video.
them all the time on X, man, because
I was
I
really
saw this
traumatized
video.
by that.
Okay. Let me just finish this thing because I want to hear that. But I thought of that when I was watching this thing. So there's this woman there at some restaurant and she gets mad and she is up in this guy's face and just saying these horrible things. And eventually this dude just punches her and lays her out. And then she's on the ground. Oh, why'd you do that? This is horrible. This is, well, no dude would have done that without the expectation of that. If you want to be treated and live like a man, you're going to act. And I don't, this is not my Christian worldview, but I'm saying if that's the world in which you want to create, then don't expect that if you want to act that way, that you're not going to be treated any differently than a man would treat another man. And that's not sexism. That's what you asked for. I
Do
don't
you
like that.
remember the TV?
That's not my world.
Do you remember the TV show The Wild Wild West?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
In the beginning of The Wild Wild West, I don't know that people pay attention to it. It's almost like a bunch of cartoons that start. It's like one of the greatest shows on television, by the way.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
remember that. Oh,
if
yeah.
I could watch it, I'd still watch it. In the beginning of the show, and I suggest everybody go ahead and Google this or YouTube it. In the videos, he shoots a bunch of men in the cartoon. But then he's kissing this woman and she's raising a knife to stab him in the
Hmm.
back. And you know what he does in that video? He knocks her out. And it's a cartoon. And that played every week on that show. I'm surprised, but it played every week. And my mother always told me, you never, ever hit a woman. But you know what that show was saying? There is some context in which you do every week.
Yeah, and we covered that actually a little bit before too.
We
It's
did.
funny, you watch old movies and there wasn't we were raised with that concept. You and I raised it, never hit a woman. But
Hmm.
the subtext of that is never hit a woman like you would hit a man. But
Exactly.
historically, there was appropriate times culturally when men could hit women. You saw it in the movies when a
All the
woman
time.
was yelling and being emotional. A guy would smack her in the face. But there was that Darwinian subtext to that whole thing. The idea was that she was reverting to, she was being hysterical. It was a biological, animalistic response. And by smacking this woman,
You could
you could
snap it
bring
out
her
of
to her, you could smack out the animal brain part and bring it to the human rational brain. And
we don't
there's a
want that. We're not
materialistic,
suggesting that.
no,
We're
I
not
am
suggesting
not.
that.
But I'm saying there was a, yeah,
We're just noting what was the
I'm
way
saying that's the
society was.
Darwinianist worldview of when it would be appropriate to hit women under that context. And I think that's what you see in that Wild Wild West idea. You see it in
Oh
old
yeah,
John Wayne movies or all
all
these
the time.
those framings.
One of the most controversial Clint Eastwood movies is he rapes a woman. And one of the
Mm.
most controversial, I mean, I don't know if I should have used that word, but in one of his most controversial woman movies, the director is keen to show that that's the action that takes place. But what the director is trying to portray is that she wanted it. You couldn't
Mm.
do that in the movies today. And that happens at the beginning of the movie.
Hmm.
And I think what it's reflecting ideas in history that people in the past were comfortable with, and they were an acknowledgement of nature that were and aspects of nature that were deeply uncomfortable. I mean, I've told the
Hmm.
story many times of Peter Paul Rubens' paintings, and how if you look at the ideas that these paintings are depicting, they're beautifully drawn. I mean, Peter Paul Rubens was an artist par excellence. But the concepts that he's showing in our day and in our society in terms of women would be viewed as horrific. But in his day, this was normal. This was the normative way of displaying particular human characteristics. Now, how does that get to Friedan? What Friedan wants to do is deny biology. She wants to deny that reality that directors and authors and writers were perceptive to bring out and to show people. And that while culturally we've moved away from those ideas, um, biological realities exist still today. And I think this is why you drew the
Yeah.
distinction between Friedan's first, second, and third wave feminism. While she could be first wave, but she couldn't really, in her mind, be second or third wave. Right? These distinctions
Hmm.
they
Yeah.
mattered.
And it strikes me when you say that too. And here's the distinction: she was rejecting a flawed Darwinian biological determinism, but she did not have a worldview that allowed for a biological teleological purpose, right? So there was a design and purpose in the biology, but it wasn't random and chaotic. It was purposeful and intentional. And when the society denies it for whatever reason, then the biology becomes a source that allows for abuse and
Hmm.
diminishing of women in this
Hmm.
case. So she
Right.
saw the abuse and the diminishment of women and their value to society, but she couldn't see the solution. So her solution was to deny biology, is what I'm driving
Hmm.
at.
No,
As
that's
opposed to
exactly
the
right.
Christian can still embrace the biological distinctives and uniquenesses without diminishing the woman because we see value and purpose in those distinctions. And that's a pretty big, important way of distinguishing the purpose and usefulness of biology. Let's get to this ethical question, though. What's the right thing to do? So ethically, Friedan believes that essentially humans should seek truth, whatever she defines that as, resist dehumanizing social roles, again, we just talked about, and pursue personal development rather than conformity. So she's going to see the push against the systems as the true fulfillment. She says things like, why should women accept the picture of a half-life instead of a share in the whole human destiny? So she sees the role of wife and mother as reductionist, as something that reduces her value to society, not as the ultimate beauty of the feminine. She thinks that being a mother, and I mean, obviously, she was shaped by her own family. Her own father was fairly dismissive of his wife, verbally, in a sense, abusive of her, controlling of her, didn't allow her to go out places. But she was, I mean, she was savaged by her mom. Friedan was not a good-looking woman, and her mother told her this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so she left her with this sense of that you are not going to find fulfillment in how other women who are beautiful do. And her mother was apparently a more attractive woman, and she let her know that your sister got the looks, you did not get the looks, and so you're going to have to find your fulfillment somewhere else. But then she said society won't allow that, so she felt trapped in that whole process.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, though, she's going to find ethical, moral things in by denying male and female identities as a whole, as all societally determined. And that's where I want to get your view on this, because this is where I want to bring it to a modern context. So, in a sense, second wave of feminism idealized masculine standards of work as the standard for women's success, but they failed to see that there's a difference between men and women, which again has resulted in the feminized realpolitik of
Mm-hmm.
the day. So in my estimation, here's my thought, and I'm going to give you a counterpoint to this that I want to get you where you fall on this. I think the second wave feminism essentially combined with the neo-Marxist ideology in third wave feminism led to what we would call, say, the wokeification of social systems, not the feminization of systems. Now, some people say that it's the feminized. Now, I think there could be a distinction of both, but they're not the same. Woke is not feminized. But here's a counterpoint. There's a gal, I don't know if you've heard of a gal named Helen Andrews.
No.
I came across her. She wrote an article, but I didn't hear the article. She was on the Charlie Kirk show being interviewed. And I want to know if you agree with sort of my take on this or her take. She wrote an article for Compact called The Great Feminization. And her thesis is this: everything, quote, everything you think of as wokeness is simply the epiphenomenon of demographic feminization. Now, here's what she backs this up with. And I'll give you the stats and then I'll show you a clip. And this is where I want you to engage with her. She says, wokeness is not a new ideology, an outgrowth of Marxism, which I think she's wrong in that. I'm just laying out more my distinction is. But she thinks the stats back up this claim, that it's a demographic feminization of politics. So as a result of the post-Obama disillusionment is simply feminine patterns of behavior applied to institutions where women were few in number until recently. How did I not see it before? Possibly because, like most people, I think the feminization is something that happened in the past before I was born. When we think of women in legal professions, for example, we think of the first woman to attend law school in 1869, or the first woman to argue a case before the Supreme Court in 1880, or the first female Supreme Court justice, 1981. A much more important tipping point is when law schools became majority female, which occurred in 2016, or when law firms' associates became majority female, which occurred in 2023. When Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed to the High Court, only 5% of judges were female. Today, women are 33% of the judges in America, 63% of the judges appointed by President Joe Biden. The same trajectory can be seen in many professions. A pioneering generation of women in the 1960s and 70s increased female representation through the 1980s and 90s, gender parity finally arriving, at least in younger cohorts, in the 2010s and 20s. In 1974, only 10% of New York Times reporters were female, and New York Times staff became majority female in 2018, which this kind of data surprised me. I didn't realize it was this tipping point for female majorities was so recent. So it's 2018, and today female share is 55%. Medical schools became majority female in 2019. Women became majority of the college-educated workforce nationwide in 2019. Women became a majority of college instructors in 2023. Women are not yet a majority in the managers of America, but they might be soon, as they are now 46%. So the timing fits wokeness around when it arose around the same time that many important institutions tipped demographically from majority male to majority female. All right, there's a bunch more. I won't read it because that's longer than I wanted it to be. But here's the clip where she takes that demographics. She's connecting that demographic shift with the what we would call the woke shift. And here's the conclusion she makes based on differences between men and women. And this is I mean, up front, I don't share this take, but I'm curious where you're at. So here's what she has to say.
I think when people hear differences between men and women, a lot of times they jump straight to stereotypes like that men are logical and women are emotional. And that's not really entirely what I'm talking about. More, I'm talking about less individual differences between men and women and more group dynamics. This is a subject that has been extensively studied in the field of psychology. If you have a group of men in a room and a group of women in a room, and you give them a task, how will these groups solve that task? How will their interactions proceed differently? And it is a sort of observed fact about group dynamics that men tend to deal open with conflict. They tend to have hierarchy. There will be a pecking order that will establish itself very quickly. And they also tend to be very task oriented. Female groups, by contrast, are very averse to hierarchy. They tend to suppress any conflict. If you broach conflict within a female group, all of the rest of the women there will shut you down and say, whoa, honey, don't make waves. They're also much less task oriented. They're more focused on making sure everybody's involved in the decision. And that's what we saw a lot with wokeness.
Okay, so Leroy, does the stats, does the differences between men and women, which we explained a little bit, does that explain the cultural shift of wokeism as she describes? Is it really just a male-female difference?
She makes a compelling case. When I was a kid, I would much rather get spanking from my dad than my mother. When my dad spanked me, he would pull off his belt, rip it out of his pants, and he hit me like 2 or 3 times. Spankings were always more painful than my mother's spankings. And my mother was far more violent, far more hurtful. But his were different because he wasn't interested in inflicting as much as he was interested in teaching me what not to do. So his demeanor when it came to corporal punishment in our home was far different than my mother's. Now, I can imagine if we could, obviously I'm taking a very anecdotal point, but I want to extrapolate that out to this. When you have a room full of men who are going to do things, of course, we're going to think that there's a logical order for how that needs to take care of. We're going to parcel out all the tasks, and then we're going to hopefully bring all those together and make sure that they get accomplished. And then we're going to hold people accountable to that task. We're going to recognize that every voice is not equal. And every idea does not need to be entertained. That's just how men think. But women are more collaborative in that way, and they're more interested in how people's feel, which explains why my mother's invective was far more damaging than anything my father ever said to me. And I love my parents. Don't get me wrong. I'm just being real. And if you extrapolate that out into the larger society, if everybody's experience is somewhat similar to mine, I would say, where dad is more interested in what you're going to be and mom is interested in whatever she's interested in. But my point is, yeah, I mean, women facing environments are going to be far more different than men facing environments. And men are going to feel displaced in those environments because the things that are valued, the things that are precisely male that are valued, are going to be frowned upon because they are not the general framework of the mindset of people. They don't express the general mindset of people who govern those spaces. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I'm not sure that you can extrapolate it all out to that, but there's some truth there that a totally woman facing environment is going to be far more different than a totally male facing environment.
I think had we not done all of our series of shows, I'd find her argument more persuasive than I do, having looked at a lot of what we've studied over the last 14 episodes over the last couple of years. And here's where I differ. Well, let me start with where we're the same. I agree that with those differences between men and women. And I think those are designed by God. They're not purely cultural. I think we would, so any group dynamic where women dominate is going to be different than when men dominate. That is true. I don't disagree with her stats that this dominance in all these fields of women has taken place very recently, which again really surprises me because I assumed that would have been much earlier. And that shift is coincident with this shift in wokeness, though. Where I disagree is her framing that as a feminization of this, that wokeness is feminization. In other words, I don't think being a woman leads to wokeness. Women aren't woke. That's not in their God designed nature. That's where I think she's wrong in that. This is the way I'm taking her, what she wrote.
Maybe modern women are, though.
That's exactly right.
Class of people, modern women, maybe.
Well, that's the thing. She's not allowing for that to say. She's saying it's not a neo-Marxist or philosophical influence that is woke. She's saying it's just the dominance of women leads to wokeness. That's where I think she's wrong. There is a coincidence of when that timing plays because women who are now educated into that worldview, into that neo-Marxist framework, that Foucaultian thinking, that's what they're indoctrinated into. And then when they do take control, that is combined with their feminine disposition that they would deny is designed by God, but is there. So yeah, they are going to structure things differently. And it's going to be their version of woke may be different than the man's version of woke. That might be true. But I think she underplays the philosophical roots of this and blames it on womanhood. And I think that's the mistake she made.
Yeah, that's the mistake. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it overreaches. But I do think that there's an element of those characteristics, and we talked about this before. Marxism wants to use any kind of oppressed situation as a fulcrum to dislodge Western cultures and values. It wants to use any of those as a fulcrum to dislodge Western cultures and values. And if it could hide in the background and never really be detected, it certainly would. If you could just hide it behind biology, then it certainly would. Marxism would certainly feel comfortable. A Marxist would certainly feel comfortable doing that. And I think like you said, we've read enough and have looked at how these ideas are cashing themselves out in reality to resist that notion and to resist that kind of hiding of the goal, because all of these mentalities that we discussed, including Friedan's, all have something that they are legitimately pointing out, right? Or a question they're legitimately raising, but the outworking of those questions are so destructive to humanity that it's hard not to see.
Yeah, I think this is where making that distinction between first wave, second wave, third wave feminism would help in bringing this to a point here of where I differ in that analysis, which is really statistical and then correlates information without really looking at causal factors, is causal philosophies in this sense. So I think in first wave feminism, where women were fighting for legal recognition, that their legal status in the United States didn't have to depend on a man. If they would have become the majority in a field, I don't even think they would have had a desire to be the majority in a field. I don't think they would have ever become a majority in any field because they still had a fundamental desire to be wives and mothers and sisters. They didn't fear those roles. They just wanted to be recognized and have the right to vote and to be able to stand alongside their men. So I don't think there would have been a dominance of females in those quote unquote male spaces because they recognized the differences. In second wave feminism, which is Friedan's, had they come to dominance in these same legal fields or others, I think it definitely wouldn't have been woke. It would have been far more masculine anyway. They would have been judges just as mean as men judges, and they wouldn't have they would have in some ways changed it because they still were women fundamentally, but they would have really tried to be like men in those roles, because that's what I think second wave feminism did, is it tried to emulate masculinity and think that that would make them better women, which is a flawed project. So I don't think it would have led to that. But it's third wave feminism, where you combine the inherent differences between men and women with a particular philosophical worldview, that you get wokeism. And so I think if you try to, in theory, put that idea of what would it look like, how would it be different, I think it shows that her analysis of blaming womanhood and femininity for the problems of woke, I bristle at that, because I don't think that's fair from a Christian worldview analysis, at least.
Right.
Okay, that's my whole take. What do you think on that?
Well, if you look at the first wave feminism, grows out of the idea that women, to protect themselves, wanted to vote. What were they protecting themselves from? Well, not every man could vote in America. You had to be a stakeholder in order to vote in America. But when single men got the vote, men who are non-stakeholders got to vote, women rightly saw that this was going to be a real imposition on them. And now they wanted the right to vote to protect themselves from those non-stakeholder men. I mean, that's where this idea really arises from. So it doesn't arise because women, the feminist movement, so to speak, it arises because you're giving these single unaccounted men the right to vote. Well, women need to be able to protect themselves from those kind of men. I mean, that's kind of where the whole movement really arises out of. But then you get where you talk about second wave feminism with Friedan, and there's a shift. Now women are fighting for autonomy and liberation from womanhood.
Mm-hmm.
They're not fighting for liberation and autonomy from men. They're fighting for liberation and autonomy from womanhood. And then third wave feminism now leads to the right question. You got it. You've got the ultimate freedom. Now, what is a woman?
Yeah.
What is a woman? What is it?
Yeah.
This is the natural result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The extreme is freedom from reality, which is insanity.
Yeah. Well, let's do our last. We've covered a lot of our other worldview questions and about purpose and meaning and right and wrong. Let's just do quickly this idea: what happens when I die? So obviously, Friedan is not going to really address the afterlife. If she's really an atheist, then she's going to, your death is death. The only death she seems to be concerned was the death of self, the end of the self, the capacity, the power to identify self through a role that actually has meaningful, quote unquote, contribution to society. So for her, death would be the lack of societal impact on a broad scale. And she would look at that role that you play in the workforce as the most meaningful, that keeps you, whether it be a legacy or publishing a book or doing whatever, that's going to be the thing that helps you live beyond your life, creating that sort of legacy, as it were, that you impacted society. But she's not going to have any fears of, will God judge me, or will there be an afterlife? Everything is purely, even though I don't think she's a materialist, but everything would be in a societal level, I guess, in a physical world reality. Any thoughts to add on that? I think it's a very depressing outlook on life, but.
Look, you raised a good question. You raised a good point earlier when you talked about her wanting to unhitch herself from abortion. Mm-hmm. Her wanting to unhitch her ideas from the consequences of abortion. If she doesn't believe in a God or some sort of ultimate judgment, why is that bad? Why unhitch yourself from it, right? So I think people have this unique ability to hold two competing ideas in their mind, and the reason why they can do that is they will hold one idea as more ultimate than the other one. So for example, I can hold the idea in my mind that I'm not going to be accountable for the things that I do in the afterlife, because there is no afterlife. But at the same time, I can also recognize that what I've done is a tremendous evil. And if there is a judgment, maybe I would be subject to it. And maybe in my deepest, darkest thoughts, I wrestle with what my ideas have. So maybe she may not frame that in terms of an afterlife, but she's certainly wrestling with the moral implications of her ideas, right? She wrestled with the implications and tried to distance herself from those implications, which may be indicative of some deep-seated questions.
Yeah. Well, what's your final thought for Christian? Let's put this for Christian women, because we talked about that a little bit earlier. We talked about even your own relationship with your wife, or your advice to other women and educational environments. What's our big takeaway when it comes to feminism and Christianity, whether that be second or third or first wave feminism? Any kind of big takeaways? What should Christian women be
My big
thinking
takeaway, my big takeaway is really this. And I'll say it just from my personal perspective as a husband to my wife. I want my wife, I spend a lot of time thinking about my wife in terms of what she wants to do. I talk to her about what she wants to do in her life and how she wants to frame her life. And I try to help her actualize it. I think it's my role as a husband given to me by God to make sure that my wife becomes all that God intends her to be, to the extent that I can, right? Within the framework that he himself has set for her and for us. Now, I recognize that not every woman would want to be bound by that framework. Not every woman would want to be married to a man who sees them in that way. But to not be bound by that is to have some consequence lived out in reality, which we've seen is destructive to women in the womb, right? It's destructive to women in the womb. Fundamentally, it's made women, less marriageable, right? Less marriageable. And it's not led to their long-term fulfillment. It's led to the manosphere.
Yeah.
And it's led to men saying, okay, if you want to be chattel and you want to be a man, then I'm going to treat you just like any old piece of thing. I mean, so
yeah.
As a Christian, I wouldn't want women to have to be in that environment. I would want women to be fulfilled, in that way. And I think good men would want the same thing. They would want to see women fulfilled to the deepest extent they can be fulfilled within a universe framed by a good and loving God. Right? I think that's a biblical way that I would say.
There is so much more that we could say about Friedan's impact on women and the concept of feminism. But for now, I want to encourage my sisters in Christ to go out and till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof on the corrosive ideas of second and third wave feminism. But for now, I want to encourage my sisters in Christ to go out and till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof on the toxic ideas of second and third wave feminism. I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.